The sword had been there for centuries, perhaps longer. It stood embedded in the heart of the black stone monolith, its blade reflecting the pale, twin moons of Kiriath Prime. Warriors of all kinds had tried to claim it. War chiefs, conquerors, warlords of the Kvari Dominion had all wrapped their hands around its hilt, believing they would be the one to pull it free. Yet, none had succeeded. Tonight, a human stood before it. Ethan Carter ran a hand through his short, dark hair, squinting up at the ancient blade. It was longer than he expected, its edges lined with inscriptions that pulsed faintly as if aware of his presence. He had seen ancient relics before, but this one had a kind of presence, something almost alive. Behind him, a scoff echoed through the night air. Zevarache folded her arms, her scaled, violet skin catching the flickering torchlight. The Kvari commander was taller than Ethan by at least a foot, her muscular form poised with the easy confidence of someone who had never been bested. Her piercing golden eyes studied him with amusement, the corners of her mouth curled in a smirk that was far from kind. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice rich with condescension. "This has to be a joke." Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "What? Afraid I'll embarrass you." A few chuckles rippled through the assembled warriors. Kvari were not known for their humor, but something about the sheer absurdity of the situation made them laugh. A human, of all things, the smallest, weakest species in the Dominion standing where only the strongest had dared. Zevarache stepped forward, circling him like a predator, considering whether the hunt was worth the effort. "You don't understand what you're looking at, do you?" She gestured to the sword with a flick of her claws. "That is Veil Therian, a blade forged long before your kind ever touched the stars. It was meant for warriors, for those who command legions, who have crushed empires beneath their boots." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You are not one of them." Ethan smiled. "No, I suppose I'm not." The answer seemed to catch her off guard. She narrowed her eyes, but said nothing. Another warrior, a hulking brute named Korvash, snorted and cracked his knuckles. "Let's remind the little human why he doesn't belong here." Without waiting for permission, he strode forward, gripping the hilt of the sword with both hands. The moment he pulled, the air seemed to vibrate with resistance. His muscles tensed, cords of strength visible beneath his thick, battle-scarred skin. A growl rumbled in his throat. Nothing happened. With a frustrated grunt, he let go, shaking out his arms as though they had gone numb. "Damn thing," he muttered. Ethan's gaze flicked to Zevarache. She exhaled sharply through her nose, stepping past him as though he didn't exist. Her long tail flicked in irritation. "If this is what it takes to make you leave," she muttered, placing her clawed fingers around the hilt, "then I will humor you." The air grew thick as she pulled. Unlike Korvash, she didn't strain. She poured strength into her stance, the way she had done countless times in battle. The stone beneath her feet cracked. The torches around them flickered violently, as if some unseen force rejected her effort. Still, the sword did not move. After several long seconds, she released it with a sharp exhale, rolling her shoulders as if shaking off unseen resistance. Her expression, carefully controlled, betrayed only a flicker of frustration before she straightened. "There," she said. "Are you satisfied?" Ethan took a slow step forward. His boots scuffed against the stone as he placed his hands on the hilt. The metal was cool beneath his fingers, a strange tingling sensation running up his arms. He inhaled deeply. Then he pulled. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the sword trembled. The sound was barely noticeable, a whisper of shifting metal, the scrape of something ancient stirring for the first time in eons. Zevarache's smirk faltered. A murmur rippled through the gathered warriors. Ethan felt something deep and unfamiliar, like the moment before a storm breaks. His grip tightened. He pulled again. The blade shifted another inch. The glow along its inscriptions brightened, the pulsing light now a steady hum. Ethan gritted his teeth, feeling resistance, not against strength, but something deeper, as if the sword was measuring him. Then suddenly it stopped. The energy faded. The glow dimmed. The resistance solidified once more, and no matter how much he willed it, the sword would not move further. Ethan exhaled, stepping back. He wasn't sure how long he had been holding his breath. He flexed his fingers, his pulse quick but steady. He had expected failure. But not this. Not almost. Behind him, the warriors were silent. Then a single, sharp laugh broke the tension. Zevarache's amusement had returned. "You almost had me worried for a second," she said, crossing her arms. "But that's all it was. Asterisk almost starred." She gestured toward the sword. "Even the best warriors of my people have never made it budge. If you think shifting it an inch is an accomplishment, you're more desperate for victories than I thought." Ethan ignored her and turned back to the sword. He could still feel the lingering hum in his fingertips, the phantom weight of something considering him. It wasn't strength that determined worthiness. That much was obvious now. So what was it? Zevarache clapped him on the shoulder, her grip firm enough to be a warning. "You've had your fun, human. Go home before you make a fool of yourself." Ethan met her gaze, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "I think I'll stay a little longer." The amusement in her eyes flickered, brief, uncertain. Then she scoffed and turned away. "Do what you want," she called over her shoulder. "Just don't say I didn't warn you." The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Ethan remained where he was, staring at the sword, still waiting in the stone. Something told him this wasn't over. The air felt different now. He knew at the moment his fingers closed around the hilt. It was subtle, a faint hum at first, a vibration running up his arm like the distant tremor of an oncoming storm. Ethan exhaled slowly, curling his fingers tighter around the ancient metal, bracing himself for the weight of failure. Then he pulled. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The torches flickered. The gathered warriors watched in silence, their expressions shifting between amusement and irritation. But then a shift. The resistance that had defied thousands of warriors for centuries yielded. The sword slid free. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through the stone beneath his feet. The inscriptions carved along the blade ignited, lines of searing blue light racing along its length, illuminating the darkened clearing in an ethereal glow. The ground trembled, a wave of invisible force rippling outward, stirring dust and loose debris into a swirling dance around him. The sheer power coursing through the weapon set his nerves alight, something ancient and unknowable flooding his senses. The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan barely heard the clatter of weapons hitting the ground as warriors staggered back in disbelief. His own pulse roared in his ears, but beneath it, beneath the stunned exhalations and muttered curses, he caught something else. A single, sharp inhale. Zevarache. She was staring at him, her golden eyes wide, unreadable. Her usual smirk, so ever-present and insufferable, was gone, replaced by something dangerously close to shock. Ethan took a steadying breath. The sword was lighter than he expected, perfectly balanced, as if it had been waiting for his grip alone. He turned it slightly, watching the way the glowing inscriptions pulsed in response to his movements. The energy, the sheer weight of its history, settled into his bones like an old memory surfacing from the depths. Someone broke the silence with a strangled sound. Corvash, the brute who had mocked him earlier. Impossible. Zevarache took a slow step forward, her gaze locked onto the weapon. "Do that again." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You want me to put it back and try again?" "Yes." He laughed. "Yeah, I don't think so." Her expression darkened, the shock burning away into something more familiar, something dangerous. "You're telling me," she said slowly, deliberately, "that after centuries of failure, after warlords, conquerors, and the strongest warriors in the dominion have tried and failed, you, a human, just pulled it out?" He twirled the sword lightly in his grip, testing the weight. "I mean, you saw it happen." The gathered Kvari murmured among themselves, some still struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Others looked furious. A few seemed almost reverent. Zevarache's jaw tightened. "That sword is not yours. Tell that to the sword," Ethan said, watching the light flicker along its edge. "Seems to think otherwise." A low growl rumbled at her throat. You think this is a game? You think some cosmic accident made you worthy? She took another step closer, and for the first time since he had met her, there was no amusement in her expression, only frustration, only something sharp and unreadable behind her golden eyes. Ethan held her gaze. No, I think maybe all of you are going about this the wrong way. The murmuring around them grew louder. Whispers of uncertainty, of challenge, of fear. The sword had chosen him. Zevarache exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through her dark hair, her tail flicking with agitation. No, she muttered, shaking her head. No, there has to be another reason. Her gaze snapped back to him, her usual confidence struggling to reassert itself. Try explaining this, then. What did you do that none of us did? Ethan considered that for a moment. Maybe, he said slowly, turning the sword in his hands, it's not about strength. Her eyes narrowed. Maybe, he continued, this wasn't a test of force. Maybe it was a test of something else. A flicker of something crossed her face, something quick and dangerous, but before she could speak, a gasp from the crowd cut through the tension. The inscription, someone whispered. Ethan glanced down. The glowing runes had shifted. Where once they had been unreadable, now the symbols were formed, rearranging themselves into something clear, something that hadn't been seen in centuries. He read the words aloud. Asterisk, the mind that dares, the heart that endures, and the soul that believes shall wield me. Asterisk, a chill rippled through the gathered warriors. Zevarache's fingers flexed at her sides, her claws twitching like she was resisting the urge to lash out. No, she muttered again, but this time there was something uncertain in her voice. Ethan exhaled, looking up at her. I think that answers your question. The air was thick with tension. Corvash shifted uneasily, exchanging wary glances with the others. The realization was sinking in. It had never been about brute strength. It had never been about who could force the sword from its prison. It was about something deeper, something few had ever considered. Ethan didn't have the raw power of the Kvari. He wasn't a warlord or a conqueror. He was just a man who refused to believe in limits. And that had been enough. Zevarache inhaled deeply, schooling her features back into something more composed, though her tail still flicked erratically behind her. This, she said, voice steady now, changes everything. Ethan smirked. Yeah, he said, feeling the weight of the sword settle into his grip. I get that a lot. For the first time in her life, Zevarache had no immediate retort. Instead, she simply stared at him, studying him with an intensity that felt almost dangerous. Then, after a long pause, she grinned. Fine, she said. Then prove it. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Prove it how? The amusement was back in her eyes now, but there was something else beneath it, something sharp and calculating. You wanted to stay a little longer? She said, stepping back, rolling her shoulders like a predator limbering up for the hunt. Then let's see what you can do with that thing in your hands. The murmurs around them swelled into something heavier, something electric. Kvari warriors straightened, eyes gleaming with anticipation. This wasn't just a revelation anymore. This was a challenge. Ethan turned the sword slightly, watching the light dance along its edge. He had spent his whole life defying expectations. One more time wouldn't hurt. He looked at Zevarache, at the barely contained energy in her stance, the way her lips curled with something halfway between excitement and menace. He grinned. All right, he said. Let's dance. The circle formed fast. Kvari warriors stepped back, some watching with skeptical curiosity, others with barely veiled anticipation. The torchlight flickered against their violet skin, their golden eyes reflecting something primal, something that lived for battle. This was no longer about the sword. This was about proving whether the one who had pulled it was worthy of holding it. Zevarache rolled her shoulders, shaking out her arms, her grin sharp as a blade's edge. She hadn't drawn a weapon. She didn't need one. Not yet. Ethan tightened his grip on the sword. It still hummed faintly, warm in his hands, as if aware of the moment. He wasn't sure what it had expected of him, what ancient force had chosen him, but right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he wasn't backing down. Rules? He asked, tilting his head. Zevarache chuckled. Try to keep up. She moved. Fast. A blur of motion, a rush of violet muscle and golden eyes. Ethan barely had time to react before she was in front of him, a strike already coming for his ribs. He twisted at the last second, the wind of her passing brushing his skin as she swept past. The ground cracked where her foot landed, the sheer force of it sending dust and loose stone into the air. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pivoted, bringing the sword up in a defensive arc, angling it between them just as she turned. The glow along the blade pulsed again, responding to him, adjusting to the weight in his hands as if it had been there forever. Zevarache's eyes flickered to it for a fraction of a second, acknowledging it, calculating. Then she grinned. Not bad. She was already moving again. This time, she didn't hold back. Ethan barely managed to parry, steel meeting clawed gauntlets with a sharp clang that sent vibrations up his arms. She was stronger, unquestionably. The impact sent him stumbling a step back, but he used the momentum, shifting into a counterstrike. Zevarache batted it aside with ease, twisting into another attack, forcing him to keep moving, keep adjusting, keep thinking. She was testing him, and he knew it. Ethan had fought before. He wasn't a stranger to combat, but this was different. Zevarache wasn't just strong. She was fast, her movements fluid, calculated, each step designed to force him off balance, to break his stance, to overwhelm. He could tell she wasn't going all out. Not yet, but she wanted to. The sword flared as he parried again, guiding his hands without force, without resistance. It wasn't just a weapon. It was something more, something alive, something that responded to him, adapted to him. The realization settled in his chest like a second heartbeat. This fight wasn't about proving himself to the Kfari. It was about proving himself to the blade. A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. Zevarache noticed. You're enjoying this, she said, circling him, her stance loose, predatory. A little. She smirked. Good. Then she came at him harder. The next strike nearly knocked him off his feet. He barely blocked in time, the impact ringing through his bones. She was done testing him. Now she wanted to see what he could really do. Ethan didn't have time to think. He let instinct take over, let the sword move with him, let the energy thrumming through it guide him. He dodged, countered, sidestepped just enough to throw her rhythm off. The warriors watching made low sounds of approval. Not because he was winning, he wasn't, but because he wasn't losing yet. Zevarache lunged again, aiming low. Ethan twisted, bringing the sword down to block. Sparks flew. For a split second, she hesitated. It was all he needed. He shifted his grip and moved. Fast. The blade arced upward, not to strike, but to force her back, to give himself space. It worked. She hopped a step away, golden eyes flashing with something wild, something excited. Then she laughed. It was rich and full and genuine. The circle of warriors stirred. Some exchanged glances. This was not the reaction they had expected. Zevarache straightened, rolling her shoulders again. All right, human, she said, tilting her head, considering. Maybe you're interesting. Ethan exhaled, still gripping the sword tightly. His muscles ached, his breath came fast, but beneath it all, something inside him thrived. He had expected hostility, challenge, resistance. What he hadn't expected was acceptance. Not full acceptance. Not yet, but something close. Zevarache studied him for a moment longer, then glanced at the sword, the glow still pulsing, steady and unwavering. It chose you, she said. I don't like it, but I can't deny it. Ethan raised an eyebrow, and her smirk returned, sharp and dangerous. And that means you have a lot to learn. He grinned. Guess I'd better start. The warriors murmured again, but this time there was no skepticism, no disbelief, only curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, respect.